December 7th, 1941, 8:15 a.m. Most Americans were still asleep when history changed forever, but one woman was already in the sky, teaching a student how to fly above the calm waters of Pearl Harbor. What she saw in the next 60 seconds would haunt her forever and transform her from a civilian flight instructor into one of America's first female military pilots. Cornelia Fort was doing what she loved most that Sunday morning, guiding a nervous student through landing practice at John Rogers Airport. The sky was perfect, clear, blue, endless. Below them, battleships sat peacefully at anchor. It was just another beautiful Hawaiian morning, until it wasn't. She noticed it first as a strange metallic glint in her peripheral vision. Then another plane, closing in too fast, too close. Her instructor instincts kicked in. She grabbed the controls from her student, pulling hard. The plane dove beneath them so close she could see the pilot's face. So close she could see something else. The red circle painted on the fuselage. The rising sun of Japan. In that single crystallizing moment, suspended between peace and war, Cornelia Fort became perhaps the only civilian pilot in the air during the opening seconds of America's entry into World War II. What happened next? The explosions, the smoke, the desperate landing, the race for survival, was only the beginning of her story. This is not just the story of Pearl Harbor. It's the story of a woman who refused to let fear or prejudice ground her dreams. A woman who would die doing what she loved, breaking barriers even in death. A pioneer whose courage deserves to be remembered not just as a footnote to December 7th, but as a testament to the unbreakable spirit of those who choose to fly, no matter the cost. Nashville, Tennessee, in the 1920s, was a world of strict expectations, especially for young women of privilege. The Fort family represented everything refined about Southern society: wealth, education, tradition, and unshakable social standing. Cornelia Fort was born into this world on February 5th, 1919, the daughter of Louise Clark Fort and Dr. Rufus E. Fort, a prominent physician and founder of the National Life and Accident Insurance Company. She should have followed the prescribed path, finishing school, debutante balls, a suitable marriage, children, charitable committees. But Cornelia had always been different. Even as a child, she possessed what her family politely called spirit, and what others might have termed stubbornness. While her siblings and cousins played the expected games, Cornelia climbed trees, rode horses at breakneck speeds, and asked questions that made adults uncomfortable. She read voraciously, not just the romantic novels deemed appropriate for young ladies, but adventure stories, biographies of explorers, accounts of pioneering women who had dared to step beyond society's boundaries. Her mother Louise hoped it was a phase. Southern society had certain immutable rules, and Louise Fort had mastered them all. She tried gently steering her daughter toward more acceptable interests: piano lessons, watercolour painting, the intricate social choreography of Nashville's upper class. Cornelia dutifully attended Miss Sarah Lawrence College in Bronxville, New York. Though even there, her independent streak was evident. She studied what interested her, not necessarily what was expected. But it was back in Nashville, during a visit home in 1940, that everything changed. She was 21 years old, supposedly preparing for her debut into society. Instead, she found herself at Berry Field, Nashville's municipal airport, watching planes take off and land with mechanical grace. Something stirred inside her, a recognition she couldn't quite name. It wasn't just fascination, it was calling. The flying lessons were supposed to be a lark, something to amuse herself before settling into real life. Her instructor, a gruff former barnstormer named J.R. McMullen, saw immediately that she had natural talent. More than that, she had passion. She approached flying with the same intensity she had brought to everything else: absolute focus, fearless determination, and an almost spiritual connection to being airborne. Her first solo flight left her transformed. "I have yet to experience anything that gives me such complete and utter satisfaction as flying," she would later write. The utter freedom of it, the detachment from Earth, the mastery of the machine. These weren't the words of someone dabbling in an amusing hobby. These were the words of someone who had discovered her purpose. Her family's reaction was predictable. Dr. Fort was bewildered. What use could his daughter possibly have for such a dangerous, unfeminine skill? Her mother was mortified. What would people say? Young women of their social standing didn't become pilots. They became wives, mothers, hostesses. They certainly didn't spend their days in greasy coveralls, learning about engines and aerodynamics. But Cornelia was 21, legally an adult, and possessed enough inheritance from her paternal grandmother to fund her passion. More importantly, she possessed something that no amount of money could buy: absolute certainty that this was what she was meant to do. Not because it was easy or socially acceptable, but precisely because it wasn't. By late 1940, she had earned her private pilot's license, but that wasn't enough. She wanted to teach others to fly, to share this transcendent experience. So she pursued her instructor's rating, spending countless hours perfecting her skills, learning not just how to fly, but how to communicate the subtle art of controlling an aircraft to others. The Fort family eventually accepted what they couldn't change, though they never fully understood it. How could they? They had been raised in a world where women's roles were clearly defined, unchanging, safe. Cornelia was choosing uncertainty, risk, a future that had no blueprint. By 1941, opportunities for female pilots were expanding, though still severely limited. The war in Europe had been raging for 2 years, and while America remained officially neutral, the aviation industry was booming with defence contracts. Skilled pilots were increasingly in demand. When Cornelia heard about opportunities to teach military cadets to fly in Hawaii, she didn't hesitate. Her mother cried when she announced her plans. Hawaii seemed impossibly far away, which was perhaps part of its appeal. There, thousands of miles from Nashville's social expectations and knowing glances, Cornelia Fort could simply be a pilot. Not a Southern belle who flew, not an oddity or a curiosity, just a skilled instructor doing work she loved. She arrived in Honolulu in July 1941, joining the civilian instructors at John Rogers Airport, who were training military students under the civilian pilot training program. The work was demanding: long hours, sometimes difficult students, the constant pressure of teaching young men who might soon be flying in combat. But Cornelia thrived. She was known for her patience, her clear explanations, her ability to remain calm in emergencies. Her fellow instructors respected her skills, even if some privately questioned whether a woman belonged in the cockpit. The students quickly learned that underestimating Miss Fort was a mistake. She could outfly most of them and had a gift for breaking down complex manoeuvres into understandable steps. More than that, she genuinely cared about their success. Teaching wasn't just a job for her, it was a calling within a calling. In her off hours, she explored the island, swam in the warm Pacific waters, wrote long letters home describing the incredible beauty of Hawaii. She made friends among the other instructors and the military personnel stationed at nearby bases. She was happy in a way she'd never been in Nashville. This was the life she had chosen, built with her own hands and determination. As autumn turned to early winter, tensions with Japan escalated. Everyone knew conflict was possible, perhaps even likely. But Pearl Harbor seemed safe, distant from any real danger. The massive naval base represented American power in the Pacific. Surely no one would dare attack it directly. Life continued with an illusion of normalcy. Training flights, weekend beach outings, the pleasant routines of a tropical posting far from the war-consuming Europe. On December 6, 1941, a Saturday, Cornelia went dancing with friends at the Officers' Club. It was a warm, perfect evening filled with music and laughter. She had an early flight scheduled for the next morning with a student named Suomala, but that was hours away. For now, there was only the present moment, the easy camaraderie, the blessed ignorance of what the next day would bring. She couldn't have known that her entire world was about to change, that within hours she would witness the beginning of America's entry into the most devastating war in human history, that the peaceful Hawaiian sky she loved so much would soon be filled with fire and death. But for now, December 6th, there was only music and dancing and the illusion that tomorrow would be just another Sunday. December 7th, 1941 dawned with the kind of perfection that makes you believe the world is a fundamentally good place. The sun rose over Oahu, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The temperature hovered at a comfortable 72 degrees. A gentle trade wind rustled through the palm trees. It was, in every measurable way, a beautiful Sunday morning in paradise. Cornelia Fort arrived at John Rogers Airport around 7:30, greeting the ground crew and checking the weather reports. Perfect flying conditions, unlimited visibility, calm winds, scattered clouds at 5,000 feet. She reviewed her lesson plan for the morning, landing practice with her student, a young military cadet. Basic but essential skills. Taking off, circling the pattern, landing, then doing it again and again until the movements became instinctive. Her student, Suomala, arrived on time, eager but visibly nervous. Landing was often the most challenging aspect of flying for new pilots, the moment when theoretical knowledge had to translate into precise physical action. Too fast and you'd bounce, too slow and you'd stall. The margin for error was slim, which was exactly why it required practice. They completed the pre-flight inspection together, Cornelia explaining each check, why it mattered, what they were looking for. This was the unglamorous but crucial part of flying, ensuring your aircraft was mechanically sound before trusting your life to it. She had learned from her first instructor that shortcuts in pre-flight could mean death in the air. At approximately 8 a.m, they took off in the Piper Cub, climbing to pattern altitude, around 1,000 feet. Below them, Pearl Harbor spread out like a detailed model, 7 battleships moored along Ford Island's eastern shore, gleaming in the morning sun. Dozens of other vessels dotted the harbour. On shore, neat rows of aircraft sat parked at Hickam Field and Wheeler Field. Everything orderly, peaceful, secure. Cornelia guided Suomala through his first approach. "Watch your airspeed," she reminded him. "Feel the airplane talking to you." He was tense, over-controlling, making the common mistake of fighting the aircraft rather than working with it. She kept her voice calm, encouraging. Learning to fly was as much about building confidence as mastering technique. They completed the landing, not graceful, but safe, and taxied back for another attempt. This was the rhythm of flight instruction. Repetition, gentle correction, gradual improvement. Cornelia had done this hundreds of times. It should have been routine. On their second approach, around 8:15 a.m, Cornelia noticed something in her peripheral vision. Another aircraft approaching from an unusual angle. Her instructor instincts engaged immediately. Someone wasn't following the traffic pattern. She scanned quickly, trying to identify the aircraft and predict its path. Aviation safety depended on pilots following established procedures, and whoever was flying, that plane was clearly not doing so. Then she saw it more clearly. Not one aircraft, but several, flying in tight formation, coming in fast and low from the northeast. That wasn't normal. Military exercises didn't happen on Sunday mornings without notice. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. Something was wrong. One of the planes broke formation, heading directly toward them. Too close, dangerously close. Every instinct Cornelia possessed screamed at her. She grabbed the controls from her startled student, no time to explain, and jerked the Piper Cub into a steep dive. The other aircraft roared past them, so close she could see the pilot clearly through the canopy. And she saw something else. Something impossible. The large red circle painted on the fuselage. The rising sun. The symbol of Imperial Japan. For a split second, her brain refused to process it. This couldn't be real. Japanese aircraft couldn't be here, over Pearl Harbor, over American territory. But her eyes didn't lie. Neither did the geometric reality of what she was seeing. Dozens of aircraft, all bearing that same symbol, swarming toward the harbour like hornets. Then the explosions began. Even from their altitude, the sound was tremendous, deep, resonant booms that she felt in her chest as much as heard. Columns of flame erupted from Battleship Row. The USS Arizona exploded with such force that the shockwave rippled across the water. Thick black smoke began pouring into the pristine morning sky. Cornelia's training took over. Fear would have to wait. Right now, she had to get her students safely on the ground. She keyed the radio, but it was chaos. Overlapping transmissions, shouting, the sound of more explosions. The peaceful morning had transformed into hell in less than 60 seconds. She brought the Piper Cub around, heading for John Rogers Airport. But as they descended, she saw more attackers coming in, wave after wave of Japanese planes. Dive bombers screaming down toward the moored ships, torpedo bombers skimming across the water, fighters strafing anything that moved. The methodical precision of it was terrifying. This wasn't a random attack. This was planned, rehearsed, executed with devastating efficiency. Landing was the most dangerous thing Cornelia had ever done. She had to focus on airspeed, altitude, wind direction, all the normal procedures, while aircraft roared overhead and explosions rocked the island. One stray burst of machine gun fire and their fragile Piper Cub would disintegrate. But there was no choice. Staying airborne meant certain death. Their only chance was to get on the ground immediately. She brought them in on final approach, hands steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Suomela sat frozen beside her, white-knuckled, staring at the chaos unfolding below. "We're going to be fine," Cornelia told him, her voice remarkably calm. "Just hold on." The wheels touched down. She had made thousands of landings in her flying career, but none had ever felt like this. The overwhelming relief of solid ground, the desperate need to get away from the exposed runway. She didn't even properly clear the landing area before pivoting the aircraft toward the nearest hangar. As soon as they stopped, Cornelia shouted at Suomela to run. Get away from the airplane, away from anything that might be a target. He stumbled out, legs shaky, still not fully comprehending what was happening. Cornelia secured the aircraft with shaking hands. Even in crisis, her instructor training insisted on proper procedures, then ran toward the buildings. All around them, John Rogers Airport was in chaos. Personnel scrambling for cover, someone shouting orders that were lost in the noise. Another explosion, closer now, shook the ground. A Japanese Zero strafed the airfield, its machine guns chewing up the runway where Cornelia's plane had been moments before. She pressed herself against a hangar wall, heart hammering. Above, the sky was thick with aircraft, some attacking, some trying desperately to get airborne to defend. The USS Arizona was burning so intensely she could feel the heat from shore. Other ships were listing, sinking, exploding. The carefully ordered harbour had become a scene of apocalyptic destruction. It lasted forever. It lasted 90 minutes. Both things felt simultaneously true. Cornelia watched, helpless, as the world changed. Every explosion represented death. Sailors trapped in sinking ships, airmen caught on the ground, civilians in the wrong place at the wrong moment. The scale of it was incomprehensible. This wasn't war as she'd imagined it from newsreels and radio reports. This was immediate, visceral, overwhelming. When the Japanese planes finally withdrew, silence fell, broken only by the roar of flames, the screams of wounded, the creaking of damaged ships. Thick black smoke obscured the sun, turning midday dark as dusk. The smell was indescribable. Burning oil, cordite, something worse that Cornelia couldn't and didn't want to identify. She found Suomela eventually, uninjured but deeply shaken. Other instructors emerged from wherever they'd taken shelter. Someone started taking roll call, accounting for everyone. Miraculously, no one at John Rogers had been killed, though several were wounded. But across the harbour, the death toll was mounting into the thousands. Cornelia could see the Arizona still burning. She would burn for days. The Oklahoma had capsized, trapping hundreds inside. The California was sinking slowly. Hickam Field was devastated. Wheeler Field was in ruins. The neat, orderly military precision of Pearl Harbor had been replaced by chaos and death. As the shock began to wear off, something else emerged in Cornelia Fort. Not just horror, not just grief, but clarity. She had seen the attack begin. She had been in the sky during the opening seconds of America's entry into the war, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that everything had changed. Not just for Hawaii, not just for the military, but for her personally. The woman who had flown that morning teaching basic landing practice was gone. In her place was someone who had looked into the face of war and understood its cost. Someone who knew that the skills she possessed, skills her Nashville family had found so unseemly and unfeminine, might be exactly what her country needed. By nightfall, martial law had been declared. The entire island was on high alert, expecting invasion. Cornelia spent the evening helping however she could, carrying messages, assisting with wounded, doing whatever small tasks needed doing. She didn't sleep that night. Neither did anyone else. In her mind, she kept seeing that Japanese pilot's face, visible for just a moment through his canopy. He had looked young, focused, doing his duty as he understood it. The thought was disturbing. Easier to hate an abstract enemy than to remember they were human too. But beyond that personal moment, beyond the immediate trauma, Cornelia Fort felt something crystallizing inside her. A determination, a purpose. If America was going to war, she wanted to serve. Not as a nurse or secretary, roles women were expected to fill, but as a pilot. Using the skills she'd fought so hard to acquire, defying so many expectations to master. She didn't know yet if that would be possible. Women weren't allowed in military aviation, and she had no reason to believe that would change. But she knew she had to try. She had seen what war looked like from the sky. She had survived something that would haunt her forever, and she refused to let that experience be meaningless. December 7th, 1941, had begun as a perfect Sunday morning in paradise. It ended with America at war, and Cornelia Fort transformed into something more than just a civilian flight instructor. The sky that she loved had become a battlefield, and somehow she would find a way back into it. The days following Pearl Harbor blurred together in a haze of shock, grief, and frantic preparation for an invasion that never came. Oahu transformed overnight from a tropical paradise into a fortress under siege. Blackout curtains covered every window. Searchlights swept the night sky. Machine gun nests appeared on beaches where tourists had strolled days before. The entire island held its breath, certain that the Japanese would return to finish what they'd started. Cornelia Fort remained in Hawaii for several weeks after the attack, though civilian flight instruction had effectively ceased. The military requisitioned John Rogers Airport for defence operations. All non-essential personnel were encouraged to evacuate, but Cornelia stayed, helping however she could. She wrote detailed reports about what she'd witnessed during the attack, the timing, the aircraft types, the tactics employed. Military intelligence wanted to document everything, and her unique perspective as the only civilian pilot, airborne during those first moments, made her testimony valuable. But beyond official debriefings, Cornelia wrestled privately with what she'd experienced. She had nightmares, the Japanese plane diving toward her, so close she could see rivets on the fuselage, the sound of explosions, the sight of the Arizona erupting in flames. She would wake, gasping, disoriented, then remember it was real, not a dream but a memory that would never fade. She also felt something unexpected. Guilt. Survivor's guilt, though she didn't have a name for it yet. Over 2,000 Americans had died that morning. She had survived without a scratch. Why? Random chance, divine providence, the arbitrary cruelty of fate. She had been in the sky at the exact moment of the attack and lived. Hundreds of sailors trapped in capsized ships, drowning in darkness, had not. The unfairness of it haunted her. In her letters home, she tried to explain what she'd witnessed, but words felt inadequate. How do you describe the sound of a battleship exploding? The smell of burning oil mixed with burning flesh? The way paradise transformed into hell in 60 seconds? Her mother wrote back begging her to come home immediately, to leave this dangerous place, to abandon flying altogether. Nashville was safe. The war was far away. Cornelia could return to the life that had been waiting for her. Marriage, family, normalcy. But Cornelia knew she could never go back. Not really. You can't unsee what she'd seen. You can't unknow what she now knew about war, about violence, about the fragility of peace. And beyond the trauma, beyond the nightmares, she felt something else growing inside her. Determination. A crystallizing sense of purpose. By late December, she secured passage on a ship back to the mainland. The voyage was tense. Everyone feared Japanese submarines. The ship sailed darkened, following a zigzag course designed to avoid torpedo attacks. Passengers wore life jackets at all times. Cornelia spent much of the journey on deck, staring at the vast Pacific, thinking about everything that had changed. She arrived in California just after Christmas, landing in a nation transformed. America had entered the war with a unity of purpose she'd never witnessed before. The debates between interventionists and isolationists that had dominated discourse for years evaporated overnight. Recruiting officers overflowed with volunteers. Factories retooled for war production. Rationing began. Everyone wanted to contribute, to serve, to strike back at the enemy that had attacked without warning. But for women who wanted to serve as more than nurses or secretaries, opportunities remained maddeningly limited. The military didn't accept female pilots. Period. End of discussion. No matter how skilled or experienced, women couldn't fly for the armed services. It was policy, backed by decades of military tradition and deeply held assumptions about gender roles. Cornelia spent early 1942 investigating her options. She returned briefly to Nashville, where her family greeted her with relief and incomprehension. They couldn't understand why she wasn't content to be home, to be safe, to let the war be someone else's concern. Dr. Fort suggested she find work with the Red Cross. Her mother hoped she might finally settle down, marry her longtime suitor who was too old for the draft. But Cornelia knew exactly what she wanted, to fly in service of her country. The question was how. She began writing letters to military officials, to aviation organisations, to anyone who might have information about opportunities for female pilots. Most responses were polite rejections. Some suggested she could contribute by working in aircraft factories. Several implied that her desire to fly in wartime reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of women's proper role. Then, in early 1942, she heard rumours about a new programme. Jacqueline Cochran, one of America's most famous female pilots, was recruiting women pilots to ferry aircraft in Britain under the Air Transport Auxiliary. It wasn't military service exactly, but it was vital war work. British women had been ferrying aircraft for years, flying new planes from factories to RAF bases, freeing male pilots for combat duty. The work was dangerous. Aircraft with no weapons, no radios, no navigation equipment beyond a map and compass. But it was real flying in service of the war effort. Cornelia applied immediately. Her credentials were impeccable, over 1,000 hours of flight time, an instructor's rating, and a unique credential no other applicant possessed. She had witnessed Pearl Harbor from the air, but the programme had limited slots and overwhelming demand. Hundreds of female pilots applied. Only the very best would be selected. While waiting for word about the British programme, Cornelia continued instructing civilian pilots, but everything felt different now. She was teaching in a nation at war, training men who would soon be flying combat missions. The responsibility weighed on her. These students wouldn't be practicing landings on peaceful Sunday mornings. They'd be flying fighters and bombers in hostile skies, hunted by enemy aircraft and anti-aircraft fire. Every lesson she taught might save their lives someday. She also followed news of the war obsessively. The Japanese conquest of Southeast Asia, the fall of Singapore, the desperate defense of Bataan and Corregidor, American forces reeling from defeat after defeat in the Pacific, the war in Europe grinding on, with Britain standing nearly alone against Nazi Germany, the Eastern Front's horrific casualties. Everywhere she looked, the news was grim. Then, in April 1942, came the Doolittle raid. 16 B-25 bombers launched from an aircraft carrier to strike Tokyo. The raid did minimal damage, but its psychological impact was enormous. America could strike back. Japan wasn't invulnerable. And the mission reminded everyone of something crucial. Air power would determine this war's outcome. Whoever controlled the skies would ultimately win. That same month, Cornelia received devastating news. The British ferry programme wasn't happening. Jacqueline Cochrane had encountered resistance from military officials who didn't want American women flying for Britain. Instead, she was in discussions about creating a domestic programme. It would take time, months, perhaps longer, to organise. But the goal was to create an American women's ferry service, flying military aircraft within the United States. The wait felt interminable. Cornelia continued instructing, continued following war news, continued writing letters to anyone who might help create opportunities for female pilots. She wasn't alone. Dozens of experienced women pilots were pushing for the same thing. Nancy Harkness-Love, another accomplished pilot, was also working behind the scenes to convince military officials that women could handle ferrying duties. The resistance was both institutional and cultural. Many military officers genuinely believed women couldn't handle high-performance aircraft. Others worried about the political and social implications of women in military aviation, even in non-combat roles. What would happen if a female pilot was injured or killed? How would the public react? Would it damage morale? Were the risks worth the potential benefits? But the counter-arguments were becoming impossible to ignore. The military faced a pilot shortage. Thousands of male pilots were needed for combat roles. Every man flying a ferry mission or training flight was a man who couldn't fly combat missions. And American women had already proven they could fly just as well as men. The civilian aviation records made that clear. Amelia Earhart's legendary flights, Jacqueline Cochrane's speed records, dozens of other women who had earned pilots' licenses and logged thousands of hours. As spring turned to summer, momentum built toward creating an official women's ferry programme. Nancy Love secured support from Air Transport Command officials for a programme that would employ civilian female pilots to ferry military aircraft. Jacqueline Cochrane worked on a parallel programme focused on training women pilots for ferry duty. The bureaucratic and political manoeuvring was complex, but progress was happening. Cornelia waited with barely contained impatience. She had seen war begin. She had survived while thousands died. She possessed skills her country desperately needed, and she was ready, more than ready, to serve. Not out of naive patriotism or romantic notions about aviation. She understood the risks. She had nightmares about Pearl Harbor that reminded her what war actually meant. But she also understood something deeper. She had been given a second chance at life that December morning. The Japanese plane that dove past her could have collided with her fragile Piper Cub, killing both her and her student instantly. A stray machine gun round could have found her during the landing. Any of 100 random factors could have resulted in her death. But she had survived. And that survival demanded something of her. Not just gratitude, but action, purpose, a refusal to waste the gift of continued life. If she could contribute, if her skills could help win this war, help prevent other young Americans from experiencing what she'd witnessed, then she had an obligation to try. In September 1942, the news she'd been waiting for finally arrived. The Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, WAFS, had been officially created under Nancy Love's direction. They were recruiting experienced female pilots immediately. Requirements were stringent: at least 500 hours of flight time, cross-country experience, current pilot's license, high school diploma, aged 21 to 35. Cornelia qualified easily on all counts. She applied immediately, attaching her credentials and a letter explaining her experience at Pearl Harbor. Within days, she received a telegram. Report to Newcastle Army Air Base, Delaware for evaluation and training, effective immediately. Cornelia Fort, the Nashville debutante who had shocked her family by learning to fly, who had witnessed the attack on Pearl Harbor from the sky, who had spent 10 months trying to find a way to serve her country, was finally getting her chance. She was going to be one of America's first female military pilots, even if the military wouldn't officially call them that. On the train journey from Nashville to Delaware, Cornelia reflected on the path that had brought her here. Every choice she'd made, defying social expectations, pursuing flying, seeking an instructor's rating, going to Hawaii, had led to this moment. She thought about the girl she'd been just 3 years earlier, uncertain what life held beyond the expected roles of wife and mother. That girl was gone, transformed by passion, purpose, and trauma into someone far more complex. Someone who understood both the terrible cost of war and the necessity of fighting it. Someone who knew that fear and courage could coexist, that you could be terrified and determined at the same time. The train carried her east toward an uncertain future, but for the first time since December 7th, Cornelia Fort felt something like peace. She was scared, she was ready, and she was exactly where she needed to be. Newcastle Army Air Base in Delaware felt like the edge of something unprecedented. When Cornelia Fort arrived in late September 1942, she found herself among an extraordinary group of women, 28 pilots in total, selected from over 80 applicants as the inaugural class of the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron. They came from diverse backgrounds, but shared common traits: exceptional flying skills, fierce determination, and a willingness to challenge every assumption about what women could do. Nancy Harkness Love, the WAFS director, was herself a testament to female aviation excellence. At 28, she had logged over 1,000 hours and held every rating she could earn. She was also politically astute, understanding that this program would face intense scrutiny and that any failure could doom opportunities for women pilots for decades. Her message to the recruits was uncompromising. They would have to be better than good. They would have to be flawless. The other women Cornelia met that first week would become legends in their own right, though few Americans would learn their names. Betty Gillies, who would become the squadron's operations officer, Aline Roney, Nancy Batson, Helen Mary Clark, all experienced pilots with hundreds of hours logged before the war. Some had worked as flight instructors. Others had earned livings as bush pilots or charter operators. A few were wealthy women who had flown as a hobby but possessed serious skills. Several were already mothers, balancing their desire to serve with concerns about leaving their families. What struck Cornelia immediately was the seriousness of purpose. These weren't thrill seekers or women trying to make a political statement. They were professional pilots responding to their country's need with the skills they possessed. The atmosphere was professional, focused, determined. They knew they were pioneers and that the eyes of skeptics and critics would be watching for any sign of failure. The training and checkout program was rigorous. Even though all the women were already experienced pilots, they had to demonstrate proficiency in military aircraft. The Army used different models than most civilian operations: more powerful engines, different handling characteristics, military radio procedures, formation flying protocols. Nancy Love supervised the transition training personally, observing every flight, noting any weakness or area needing improvement. Cornelia threw herself into the work with characteristic intensity. After months of frustration and waiting, she was finally doing something meaningful. The aircraft were magnificent, powerful, responsive, designed for performance rather than comfort. Learning their quirks and capabilities felt like the most important education she'd ever received. These weren't gentle training aircraft like the Piper Cubs she'd instructed in. These were warplanes, minus the weapons, but the training went beyond technical skills. The women had to learn military customs and procedures, how to read weather briefings, navigation using military maps and protocols, emergency procedures specific to military aircraft, understanding the ferry system, picking up aircraft at factories, flying them to military bases, then catching transport back to repeat the process. It was grueling work with long hours, constant travel, and significant danger. The danger was real and immediate. They would be flying aircraft just off the assembly line, often with mechanical issues not yet identified. They'd fly without radios in many cases, navigating by dead reckoning and visual landmarks. Weather forecasts were rudimentary, emergency landing options were limited, and they'd be flying alone. No wingman, no backup, no rescue if something went wrong. Ferrying aircraft had one of the highest fatality rates in military aviation, and that was before adding the complications of new aircraft and pilots unfamiliar with each model. Yet none of the women hesitated. They understood the risks, they had calculated the odds, and they had decided the mission was worth it. Every aircraft they ferried meant one more male pilot freed for combat duty, one more fighter or bomber or trainer available where needed. Their contribution might not involve dogfighting or bombing raids, but it was essential to the war effort. The military establishment's reaction to the WAFs ranged from grudging acceptance to open hostility. Some officers appreciated having additional ferry pilots available. Others resented women entering what they considered a male domain. Base commanders weren't sure how to accommodate female pilots. Barracks were segregated by sex, but there weren't facilities designed for women officers. Dining halls had to be adjusted. Uniform regulations were unclear. The women navigated this resistance with a combination of professionalism and quiet defiance. They didn't demand special treatment, but they also didn't accept disrespect. When male pilots suggested they couldn't handle high-performance aircraft, the women demonstrated their skills and let the results speak. When base commanders tried to impose arbitrary restrictions, Nancy Love pushed back through official channels, armed with endorsements from Air Transport Command leadership. Media coverage added another complication. The WAFs attracted significant press attention, newspapers and magazines fascinated by the novelty of women flying military aircraft. Photographers wanted glamour shots. Reporters asked questions that revealed deep ignorance about aviation and condescending assumptions about women. The coverage was generally positive, but often focused more on the women's appearance and personal lives than their professional accomplishments. Cornelia found the media attention particularly uncomfortable. Reporters discovered her Pearl Harbor experience and wanted to write sensationalized accounts of the girl pilot who saw the war start. She gave a few interviews, trying to redirect attention from herself to the program's importance. But she disliked the spotlight, preferring to let her flying speak for itself. She had learned at Pearl Harbor that war wasn't romantic or glamorous. It was terrible and necessary, and those who truly understood that didn't need to talk about it constantly. By November 1942, the WFS began ferry operations in earnest. Cornelia's first assignment was flying a PT-19 trainer from the factory in Pennsylvania to a training base in Mississippi. It should have been routine, a simple aircraft, a straightforward route, good weather. But as she climbed into the cockpit, alone, preparing to fly a military aircraft on an official mission, the significance overwhelmed her. 10 months earlier, she had been running for cover as Japanese planes strafed Pearl Harbor. Now she was contributing to America's response. The flight went perfectly. She navigated by map and landmarks, landed safely, filed her paperwork, and caught a transport back to Newcastle. One aircraft delivered. Hundreds more would follow. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't glamorous. But it was meaningful work that had to be done by someone, and she was profoundly grateful to be the one doing it. As the weeks passed, Cornelia flew continuously. PT-19s, BT-13s, AT-6s, trainers of increasing complexity and power. The work was exhausting but satisfying. She'd leave Newcastle, fly to a factory or depot, pick up an aircraft, deliver it to a base somewhere in the United States, then catch military transport back to start again. Sometimes she'd complete multiple deliveries in a week. Other times, weather or mechanical issues would delay her for days. The living conditions were often primitive. Military bases didn't have facilities for women officers because women officers weren't supposed to exist. The WAFS sometimes slept in supply closets or offices converted into makeshift quarters. Bathing facilities were improvised. Meals were eaten in segregated sections of mess halls. The women adapted with humour and determination, treating each challenge as another obstacle to overcome. But the real reward was the flying itself. Cornelia was doing what she loved most, in service of something larger than herself. Every hour in the air felt meaningful. Every aircraft delivered represented a contribution to the war effort. She was no longer just a skilled pilot. She was part of America's response to Pearl Harbor, part of the massive mobilization that would ultimately determine the war's outcome. The other WAFS became her closest friends and confidants. They shared experiences no one else could fully understand. The unique challenges of being female pilots in a military system designed entirely around male personnel. The subtle and not so subtle discrimination. The constant need to prove themselves. The pressure of knowing that every mistake would reflect not just on them personally, but on all women pilots. They also shared the simple joy of flying with people who truly understood it. Most of them had spent years being the only woman in civilian flying circles, explaining their passion to people who found it strange or inappropriate. Here, finally, they were among their own kind. Women who felt the same transcendent freedom in the air, who understood the subtle artistry of perfect flight, who had sacrificed social approval and conventional opportunities to pursue this calling. In December 1942, 1 year after Pearl Harbor, Cornelia flew over Hawaii on a ferry mission delivering aircraft to the Pacific Theater. As she passed Oahu, she could see Pearl Harbor below, battleships still being repaired or salvaged. The Arizona remained where she had sunk, marked by an oil slick that still rose from her submerged hull. Cornelia circled once, saying a silent prayer for all who had died that day, then continued on her mission. She thought about how much had changed in 12 months. The despair and shock of that December morning had transformed into determined action. America had taken devastating blows but had begun fighting back. The war was far from over. Everyone knew years of brutal combat still lay ahead. But the nation had mobilized its full strength, including contributions from people previously told they couldn't serve. By early 1943, the UAFS's success had become undeniable. The women were delivering aircraft safely and efficiently, maintaining excellent safety records, and freeing male pilots for combat duty. Even skeptics had to acknowledge that the experiment was working. Plans were already underway to expand the program significantly, eventually absorbing Jacqueline Cochran's separate women's training program into a unified organisation that would become the Women Air Force Service Pilots, the WASPs. Cornelia's role in all this remained relatively quiet. She wasn't a commander or administrator. She was simply an exceptionally skilled pilot doing excellent work. But those who flew with her or evaluated her performance recognised something special. She had an almost supernatural ability to handle any aircraft she encountered. Her navigation was precise, her judgment sound, her commitment absolute. She also wrote eloquently about the experience, though these writings wouldn't be published until after her death. In private journals and letters to friends, she captured what it meant to be a woman pilot serving in wartime. The pride, the frustration, the sense of purpose, the constant awareness that they were helping write a new chapter in aviation history. I have yet to have a feeling which approached in satisfaction that of having signed, sealed and delivered an airplane for the United States Army, she wrote. The attitude of the military personnel who work with us indicates that they appreciate our work and that we are releasing men for combat. This wasn't boasting, but rather quiet satisfaction in meaningful work well done. As winter turned to spring in 1943, Cornelia Fort had logged hundreds of ferry hours across dozens of aircraft types. She had proven beyond any doubt that women could fly military aircraft safely and professionally. She had helped establish a program that would eventually see more than 1,000 women pilots serving their country, and she had found something she'd been searching for since that terrible December morning, a way to transform her survival into service, her trauma into purpose, her skills into genuine contribution to the war effort. But her story was about to reach a tragic conclusion that would cement her place in aviation history while robbing her of the long future she deserved. The sky she loved so much, the sky that had given her freedom and purpose, would soon claim her life in the most senseless, preventable way imaginable. March 21st, 1943, dawned clear and cool over Texas. Spring was asserting itself across the southern plains, bringing mild temperatures and generally favourable flying weather. For Cornelia Fort, it was just another working day, another aircraft to ferry, another contribution to the war effort. She had no way of knowing it would be her last. She had been assigned to deliver a BT-13 Valiant, a basic trainer known affectionately and not so affectionately among pilots as the Vultee vibrator, for its tendency to shake at certain speeds. It wasn't a glamorous aircraft, but it was crucial for training the thousands of pilots America needed. The BT-13 was typically a student pilot's first experience with more complex aircraft systems, retractable landing gear, two-way radio, variable pitch propeller. Learning to master it prepared pilots for the transition to more advanced warplanes. Cornelia had flown BT-13s many times before. She knew its quirks, its handling characteristics, its reliable if unexciting performance. This delivery should have been routine. Ferry the aircraft from Long Beach, California, to Love Field in Dallas, Texas. The route was well established, the weather forecast favourable, the aircraft mechanically sound. She wasn't flying alone. Due to the number of aircraft being ferried, 6 BT-13s were being moved together in a loose formation. This was common practice, multiple ferry pilots moving aircraft along the same route at the same time. It provided a measure of safety through numbers. If one pilot encountered difficulties, others could observe and report. It was also more efficient for coordinating ground transportation at the destination. The other pilots in the formation included several men who were also ferry pilots, though not part of the WASP. This mixing of male and female ferry pilots was becoming more common as the program expanded. Most interactions were professional and respectful. The men had learned that the women pilots were skilled and serious about their work. Any initial scepticism had been dispelled by performance, but not everyone had adjusted their attitudes. Not everyone had fully accepted women in military aviation. And on this particular flight, one pilot's thoughtless action would have catastrophic consequences. The formation was flying at approximately 1,500 feet, maintaining loose spacing as they crossed Texas. The weather was excellent, unlimited visibility, calm winds, scattered clouds, perfect flying conditions. Cornelia was likely enjoying the flight, as she always did. Despite hundreds of ferry missions, she never lost her love for being airborne. Each flight was an opportunity to experience the freedom and transcendence that had first drawn her to aviation. According to witness statements and accident investigation reports, what happened next occurred with shocking suddenness. One of the male ferry pilots decided to practice a barrel roll or some other acrobatic manoeuvre. Why he chose to do this, while flying in formation in an aircraft not designed for aerobatics, while ferrying a military asset, has never been satisfactorily explained. Perhaps he was showing off. Perhaps he was bored and wanted excitement. Perhaps he simply wasn't thinking about the consequences. Whatever his reasoning, he initiated the manoeuvre without warning the other pilots. His BT-13 suddenly rolled and dove toward Cornelia's aircraft. She likely saw him coming. Her situational awareness was always excellent. She may have attempted evasive action, but there wasn't enough time or space. The margins were too slim. The aircraft collided. The impact wasn't head-on, but rather a strike against her left wing. In a more robust aircraft, this might have caused damage, but remained survivable. But the BT-13, for all its utility as a trainer, was not built to withstand mid-air collisions. The left-wing structure failed catastrophically. The aircraft became uncontrollable almost instantly. Cornelia Fort had only seconds to react. In those terrible moments, she would have known exactly what was happening. She had logged over 1,000 hours. She understood flight dynamics, understood what structural failure meant. She would have tried to regain control, fought the aircraft's death spiral, attempted everything her training and experience suggested. But some situations are unrecoverable. Some accidents are unsurvivable. The BT-13 plunged toward the Texas plains below. Whether she remained conscious throughout the descent, whether she had time to think about her life, or feel fear or regret, or simply focus on fighting for survival, no one can know. What is certain is that Cornelia Clark Fort, aged 24, who had survived the attack on Pearl Harbor, who had broken barriers for women in aviation, who had contributed so much to her country's war effort, died on impact in a Texas field. She was the first female pilot in American history to die while on active military duty. The distinction was historic, but hollow. Her death served no strategic purpose. It didn't occur in combat or while accepting noble risk. It was simply a senseless accident caused by another pilot's recklessness and poor judgment. News of the crash reached Newcastle Army Air Base within hours. Nancy Love had to notify the other WAFS members, had to face the reality she had dreaded since the programme's inception, that skilled, careful, professional female pilots could still die because of circumstances beyond their control. The other women pilots felt the loss deeply. Cornelia had been one of the originals, one of the first 28. She had been respected for her skills and loved for her quiet determination. The military investigation that followed was thorough but frustrating. The pilot who caused the collision survived with injuries. He claimed he hadn't seen Cornelia's aircraft, that the collision was an accident. Technically, this was true. He probably hadn't intended to strike her plane, but his decision to perform aerobatics in formation, without warning, demonstrated catastrophically poor judgment. He received discipline but no criminal charges. The accident was ruled exactly that, an accident, a tragic consequence of pilot error. In Nashville, the Fort family received the news with devastating grief. Dr. and Mrs. Fort had feared this outcome since Cornelia first began flying. They had watched their headstrong daughter defy social conventions, pursue a dangerous career, refuse to settle into safe domesticity. They had worried every day she was in Hawaii, then worried differently when she returned to flying military aircraft. Now their worst fears had materialised. Their daughter was dead at 24, killed doing something they had never fully understood or supported. The funeral was held in Nashville with full military honours. Fellow WAFS members attended, as did military officials and aviation leaders. The ceremony acknowledged Cornelia's service and sacrifice, though the military couldn't quite figure out how to recognise her officially. The WAFS were civilian employees, not actual military personnel. They wore uniforms and flew military aircraft, but legally they existed in an ambiguous space between civilian and soldier. This bureaucratic ambiguity became painful for Cornelia's family. Because she wasn't technically military, some benefits and recognitions didn't apply. Her death would eventually contribute to arguments for giving the WAFS full military status, but that came too late for Cornelia. She died serving her country without the country fully acknowledging that service. Her fellow WAFS members were devastated, but also angry. Cornelia's death was preventable. It resulted from recklessness, from a male pilot's thoughtless actions, from a culture that still didn't fully take women pilots seriously as equals. If the pilot who caused the collision had respected Cornelia's presence, had treated the formation flight with appropriate professionalism, had remembered that ferry duty was serious work, not recreational flying, she would have lived. The accident also highlighted broader issues about how women pilots were perceived and treated. Despite proving their skills hundreds of times over, despite safety records as good as or better than male ferry pilots, women still face casual disrespect and dismissiveness. Some male pilots viewed them as novelties rather than professionals. This attitude created dangerous situations. When people aren't taken seriously, safety protocols can erode. Nancy Love used Cornelia's death to push even harder for official military status for women pilots. She argued that if women were dying in service to their country, they deserved recognition as military personnel with all attendant rights and benefits. The fight would continue for years, ultimately unsuccessful. The WAFS and later WASPs would be disbanded in 1944 without ever receiving full military status. Not until 1977 would female pilots be admitted to military flight training. Not until 2009 would the WASPs receive congressional gold medals acknowledging their service. In the immediate aftermath, though, there was simply grief. The WAFS had lost one of their own. The aviation community had lost a skilled and dedicated pilot. America had lost someone who had witnessed history and responded with service. And the Fort family had lost a daughter who had chosen her own path despite every obstacle. Cornelia's belongings were returned to her family, her flight logs meticulously documenting hundreds of hours, her journals and letters, photographs of her with other pilots. In one letter written shortly before her death, she had reflected on the meaning of her work. "I am grateful that my one talent, my only knowledge, flying, happens to be of use to my country when it is needed. That's all the luck I ever hope to have." Reading those words after her death was almost unbearable. She had been so clear about her purpose, so committed to contributing however she could, and she had paid the ultimate price for that commitment, killed not by enemy action, but by preventable accident. The BT-13 that struck Cornelia's aircraft was eventually repaired and returned to service. The pilot who caused the collision continued flying, though reportedly haunted by what had happened. The war continued its brutal progression across Europe and the Pacific. Individual deaths, however tragic, couldn't slow the massive machinery of global conflict. But for those who knew Cornelia Fort, who understood what she represented and what she had accomplished, her death meant something profound. It represented both how far women had come in aviation and how far they still had to go. It demonstrated that breaking barriers could be deadly, that pioneers often pay prices that those who follow will never face. In the Texas field where she died, there was no immediate marker or memorial. The wreckage was cleared, the land returned to agricultural use. You could pass the spot and never know that history had briefly touched there, that someone extraordinary had died there. But the impact of Cornelia Fort's life and death rippled outward in ways both visible and invisible. Every woman who became a military pilot afterward flew in skies that Cornelia had helped open. Every barrier that fell, every assumption that was challenged, every young girl who looked at an airplane and thought, "I could do that," all of them were part of Cornelia Fort's legacy. She hadn't lived to see the world she was helping create, but she had contributed to its creation nonetheless. March 21st, 1943, had dawned clear and promising. It ended with a family in grief, a program in mourning, and American aviation having lost one of its pioneers. Cornelia Fort was dead at 24. The sky she loved had claimed her, but the freedom she represented, the courage to defy expectations, to serve when needed, to fly despite all obstacles, that would endure. To understand what Cornelia Fort's death meant, we must first understand who she truly was beyond the headlines and official reports. History often reduces pioneers to symbols, convenient narratives of bravery and determination that smooth over the complex, contradictory reality of actual human beings. Cornelia deserves better than that simplification. Those who knew her well describe a woman of remarkable contrasts. She was confident in the cockpit, but often uncertain in social situations. She was fiercely independent, yet longed for connection and belonging. She broke social conventions regarding women's roles, while simultaneously missing aspects of the traditional life she had rejected. She was brave, but not fearless. Rather, She was someone who felt fear deeply and flew anyway. Her letters and journals, preserved by her family and later archived, reveal a thoughtful person wrestling with questions about purpose, identity, and belonging. She wrote beautifully, with a gift for description and emotional honesty that suggested she might have been an accomplished writer had she chosen that path instead. But flying had claimed her completely, and everything else, including her writing, served that central passion. One recurring theme in her personal writings was the tension between her love of flying and her awareness of what that choice cost her socially. Nashville society never fully forgave her rejection of conventional expectations. Former friends married, had children, participated in the social rituals Cornelia had abandoned. Their letters to her, warm but with an undercurrent of confusion, asked when she would settle down and rejoin the world they shared. They couldn't understand that she had found something more compelling than settlement. Her relationship with her family remained complicated until the end. Dr. and Mrs. Fort loved their daughter, but wished desperately that she wanted different things. They saw her flying as a dangerous phase that would eventually pass. When she went to Hawaii, they hoped she would tire of it and return home ready for marriage and family. Pearl Harbor shattered that hope, but also made them understand, perhaps for the first time, that Cornelia's commitment to aviation wasn't rebellion or stubbornness. It was genuine calling. After Pearl Harbor, their correspondence shifted. They still worried constantly, but they stopped trying to change her mind. Dr. Fort wrote, asking for detailed descriptions of what she had witnessed that December morning, treating her testimony with the respect he would give any professional observer. Her mother stopped mentioning potential suitors and instead asked about flying conditions and aircraft specifications, trying to understand the world her daughter inhabited. But the gap remained. How could they truly understand? They had never felt what Cornelia felt in the air, the transcendent freedom, the perfect clarity of purpose, the sense of rightness that she described as being fully alive. To them, flying was transportation or recreation. To Cornelia, it was identity itself. Her relationship with other women pilots was similarly complex. The WAFS provided the first community where she truly belonged, women who understood flying's pull without explanation. But even there, differences emerged. Some of the women were married, managing the complications of husbands and aviation careers. Cornelia was single, which gave her freedom, but also loneliness. She wanted romance and partnership, but refused to compromise her flying for it, and few men could accept that priority. In one particularly revealing letter to a friend, she wrote, "I do not regret the choice I've made, but I sometimes regret that it had to be a choice at all, that I couldn't have both the sky and a conventional life. But since I cannot, I choose the sky every time. Some people think that makes me hard or unfeminine. Perhaps they're right. Or perhaps they simply don't understand that softness and strength can coexist." That coexistence of seeming opposites defined her. She could be tough, demanding as an instructor, uncompromising about standards, willing to call out incompetence or disrespect. But she was also remarkably kind. Multiple students described her patience and encouragement, her gift for finding exactly the right words to build confidence. She remembered birthdays, wrote encouraging letters to struggling pilots, and quietly helped colleagues who were having financial difficulties. She was also funny in ways that didn't make it into official records. Her fellow WAFS members remembered her quick wit and ability to find humour in absurd situations. When military bureaucracy created ridiculous complications, which it frequently did, Cornelia would compose satirical letters that had everyone laughing. When male pilots made condescending comments about women pilots, she would respond with perfectly calibrated sarcasm that made her point without descending into argument. But beneath the confidence and competence was someone who struggled with self-doubt in ways that might surprise people who only knew her reputation. Her journals reveal a woman constantly questioning whether she was good enough, whether she truly belonged, whether her contributions mattered. The Pearl Harbor experience had left psychological scars that she rarely discussed, but that emerged in private writings: nightmares, anxiety about flying in certain conditions, survivor's guilt that she couldn't entirely shake. She dealt with this through flying itself. When doubt or trauma threatened to overwhelm her, she would fly. The act of controlling an aircraft, of trusting her skills and making split-second decisions, restored her sense of capability. The sky was simultaneously her wound and her healing, the place where she had witnessed horror and the place where she found peace. Her political views were more complex than the simple patriotism often attributed to her. She believed deeply in America and was willing to die defending it. But she was also clear-eyed about the nation's flaws. She wrote about the irony of fighting for freedom while women lacked full citizenship rights. She observed racial discrimination at military bases with disgust, noting in her journal that it was absurd to claim we're fighting for democracy while denying it to millions of our own citizens. These observations didn't diminish her commitment to the war effort, but they complicated it. She could hold multiple truths simultaneously. America was worth defending, and America needed to change. The war was necessary, and war was terrible. Service was meaningful, and service was exploited. She refused simple narratives and easy answers, even when they would have been more comfortable. Her spirituality was similarly nuanced. Raised Presbyterian, she maintained a belief in something transcendent but had complicated relationships with organised religion. She found God more readily in the sky than in church, a personal theology built around moments of clarity at altitude, where the Earth's problems seemed both distant and solvable. She prayed, but not in conventional ways. Her communion was with altitude and distance, with the liminal space between Earth and heaven, where she felt most herself. The months between Pearl Harbor and her death showed a woman fully inhabiting her purpose. She worked constantly, logged incredible hours, and maintained standards that impressed even skeptical military officials. But she also made time for relationships, writing long letters to friends, taking leave to visit family, developing close friendships with other WAFS members. She dated occasionally, though never seriously. She wanted love, but wouldn't settle for partners who needed her to be smaller than she was. One relationship that meant a great deal to her was with Nancy Love. Love was older, more politically connected, more strategic in her approach to advancing women's aviation opportunities. But she recognised in Cornelia something special, not just skill, but moral clarity and absolute integrity. Love relied on Cornelia for honest feedback about how the programme was functioning, knowing she would tell the truth even when it was uncomfortable. After Cornelia's death, Love would say she lost not just a skilled pilot, but a friend and moral compass. Cornelia Fort had no interest in politics or positioning, Love later wrote. She cared about three things: flying well, serving honourably, and treating everyone with fairness. In a world full of people angling for advantage, she was refreshingly direct. I trusted her completely. That trust was earned through consistent character. Cornelia didn't play favourites, didn't gossip, didn't compromise her standards for convenience. If something was wrong, she said so, but always with the goal of improvement, never merely to criticise. If someone needed help, she provided it without expecting recognition or reward. She had internalised a code of conduct that required no enforcement because it was simply who she was. In her final months, multiple people noticed she seemed particularly alive, engaged, energised, clearly operating at peak capability and satisfaction. The frustration and impatience that had marked her waiting period after Pearl Harbor had vanished. She had found a place and was making full use of it. Every flight mattered. Every aircraft delivered contributed to the war effort. Every day she proved that women belonged in military aviation. She also seemed to have made peace with mortality, not in a fatalistic way, but with a clarity about what mattered. In letters written in early 1943, she reflected on the meaning of service, the acceptance of risk, and the question of legacy. She didn't expect to be remembered particularly. She saw herself as one small part of a vast effort. But she hoped the programme would continue, that women pilots after her would have opportunities she had helped create. "I don't require immortality," she wrote to a friend in February 1943. "I require only that my work means something, that it contributes to something larger than myself. I've been given extraordinary opportunities and unusual luck. If that luck runs out tomorrow, I will have lived more fully in my 24 years than most people manage in 80. I will have flown, served, mattered. That's enough." It's almost unbearable to read those words now, knowing that her luck would run out barely a month later. But they reveal her essential nature, someone who had calculated the odds, accepted the risks, and decided the meaning was worth the danger. She understood that pioneering was perilous. She chose to pioneer anyway. The woman who died on March 21st, 1943, was not a simple hero or uncomplicated symbol. She was complex, contradictory, deeply human. She contained multitudes, strength and vulnerability, confidence and doubt, revolutionary courage, and conventional longings. She broke barriers while missing aspects of the world those barriers had protected. She was exactly the kind of person who changes history, imperfect, determined, willing to pay costs that others wouldn't accept. Understanding this complexity makes her sacrifice more profound, not less. She didn't die because she was fearless or because she underestimated danger. She died because she believed so deeply in what she was doing that the risks were acceptable. She died because she refused to let fear or social pressure keep her grounded. She died because she had found her purpose and pursued it with absolute commitment. And that willingness to be fully herself, despite all obstacles, to serve despite all costs, to fly despite all dangers, that was Cornelia Fort's true gift to the world. Not just the barriers she broke or the aircraft she delivered, but the example she set of living with absolute integrity, choosing purpose over safety, becoming who you truly are regardless of what others expect. Cornelia Fort's death sent shockwaves through the small but growing community of women military pilots. The WAFS program was barely 6 months old, still provisional, still fighting for legitimacy and permanence. Every flight, every delivery, every interaction with military personnel carried weight beyond the immediate task. The women were constantly being evaluated, constantly proving themselves, constantly aware that any failure could doom opportunities for women pilots for generations. And now one of them was dead. Not due to incompetence or mechanical failure or weather, factors that sometimes claim male ferry pilots, but due to another pilot's reckless judgment. The injustice of it was overwhelming. Cornelia had survived Pearl Harbor, had logged hundreds of safe ferry hours, had maintained perfect professionalism, and a thoughtless colleague had killed her for no reason beyond carelessness. Nancy Love faced an immediate crisis. She had to keep the program functioning while managing grief, anger and fear among the remaining WAFS members. She had to deal with military officials who might use this death as evidence that women shouldn't be flying military aircraft. She had to navigate press coverage that could either honour Cornelia's service or sensationalise her death in ways that damaged the program. And she had to do all this while dealing with her own grief over losing someone she had respected deeply. Her response demonstrated the political acumen that made her an effective advocate. She refused to let Cornelia's death be minimised or dismissed. She insisted on full investigation and appropriate accountability. But she also refused to let it become an excuse to question women's aviation capabilities. Cornelia Fort died in an accident that could have killed any pilot, Love wrote in a statement. Her death reflects the inherent dangers of ferry duty, not any limitation of female pilots. She died serving her country with skill and honour. That service should be recognised, not questioned. The other WAFS members dealt with their grief through the most meaningful tribute they could offer. They kept flying. Within days of Cornelia's death, every remaining pilot was back in the cockpit, delivering aircraft, proving that one tragedy wouldn't stop the program. They flew with heavy hearts but steady hands, transforming grief into determination. Some of them wrote about Cornelia in personal journals and letters, preserving details that might otherwise have been lost. They remembered her laugh, her slightly crooked smile, the way she'd run her hand through her short hair when concentrating. They recalled her patience with struggling students, her intolerance for shoddy work, her ability to remain calm in emergencies. They documented the human being, not just the pioneer. Betty Gillies, who had become one of Cornelia's closest friends in the WAFS, wrote a particularly moving tribute. She was one of those rare people who seemed to have found exactly what she was meant to do. So many of us spend our lives searching for purpose. Cornelia found hers and pursued it with absolute conviction. She didn't waste a single day. She packed more living into her 24 years than most people manage in twice that time. We should all be so lucky as to die having truly lived. The broader aviation community also mourned Cornelia's loss. She had become known not just as a skilled pilot, but as someone who represented aviation's best values: professionalism, continuous improvement, respect for the craft. Male pilots who had initially doubted women's capabilities found themselves grieving someone they had come to respect as a true colleague. The loss transcended gender politics. The aviation world had lost one of its talented members, but the most profound impact was on women who dreamed of flying. Cornelia's death could have discouraged them. Here was proof that aviation was dangerous, that breaking barriers carried real costs. But for many, her sacrifice had the opposite effect. She had proven that women could fly military aircraft at the highest level. She had served with distinction. And yes, she had died. But she had died doing something meaningful, something she loved, something that contributed to a cause larger than herself. Letters poured into the WAF's headquarters from women across America, expressing determination to follow Cornelia's path. "Her death makes me more committed, not less," wrote one aspiring pilot. She proved it was possible. She showed that women belong in military aviation. If I can honour her memory by continuing what she started, then her sacrifice won't be meaningless. This response illustrated something crucial about pioneering. The first generation breaks barriers, knowing they may not live to see the world they're creating. Cornelia hadn't expected personal glory or permanent recognition. She had simply wanted to contribute, to serve, to prove what was possible. And in that, she had succeeded completely. Every woman who flew after her, every barrier that fell, every assumption that was challenged, all of it bore Cornelia's influence, even when her name was forgotten. The military establishment's reaction to her death was more complicated. Some officials genuinely mourned the loss and appreciated the WAFS's contributions. Others saw it as an opportunity to question the entire programme. If women could be killed by the inherent dangers of ferry duty, was it appropriate to expose them to such risks? Shouldn't female pilots be restricted to safer roles? Perhaps the experiment had gone far enough. Nancy Love fought these arguments with data and logic. Male ferry pilots died regularly. The job was inherently dangerous. Cornelia's death rate per 1,000 hours flown was actually lower than the average for male ferry pilots. The accident that killed her wasn't related to gender, but to another pilot's poor judgment. Grounding women pilots, because one had been killed by someone else's recklessness, made no sense. She also made moral arguments. If women were willing to accept the risks, if they understood the dangers and volunteered anyway, didn't they have the right to serve? If their contributions freed male pilots for combat duty, wasn't that militarily valuable? If they could do the job safely and effectively, what justification existed for excluding them? These arguments prevailed, though not without struggle. The WAFS programme continued, eventually merging with Jacqueline Cochran's training programme to form the Women Air Force Service Pilots. By the war's end, more than 1,000 women would serve as WASPs, flying every aircraft in the military inventory except combat missions. 38 would die in service, though most of their names remain unknown to the general public. Cornelia's family dealt with her death privately, struggling with complicated grief. They mourned the daughter they loved while grappling with the reality that they had never fully understood her choices. Dr. Fort, in particular, spent the rest of his life trying to comprehend what had driven Cornelia to reject safety for service, conventional life for aviation. He collected every article about her, saved every letter, preserved her journals and photographs. It was as if, by documenting her life meticulously, he could finally understand who she had been. Mrs. Fort's grief took a different form. She established a scholarship fund for young women pursuing aviation, ensuring that other daughters would have opportunities Cornelia had fought so hard to secure. She attended WASP reunions, becoming friends with women who had served with Cornelia. In their stories, she found a version of her daughter that Nashville society had never fully seen: confident, skilled, beloved by colleagues, fully alive in ways she had never been in her conventional life. The physical memorials to Cornelia were modest, a small marker in the family plot in Nashville, her name on the WASP Memorial at Avenger Field in Texas, a brief mention in aviation history books. For decades, that was all. The WASP program itself was disbanded in December 1944, its members sent home without veterans' benefits, without recognition of their military service, without acknowledgement that they had contributed meaningfully to the war effort. But absence of formal recognition didn't mean absence of impact. Every woman who became a military pilot after World War II, and there were none for 30 years, eventually followed a path that Cornelia had helped clear. When women were finally admitted to military flight training in the 1970s, they were building on foundations laid by the WASPs. When Sally Ride became the first American woman in space, she acknowledged debt to aviation pioneers like Cornelia Fort. The story of Cornelia's survival at Pearl Harbor and subsequent death in service became part of WASP oral history, passed down through generations of women pilots. It illustrated both the progress that had been made and the costs that pioneers paid. Young women learning to fly military aircraft heard about Cornelia Fort and understood they were part of a continuum, that the opportunities they enjoyed had been purchased with courage and sacrifice. In Nashville, memories of Cornelia gradually shifted. The scandal of her unconventional choices faded as perspectives changed. By the 1970s, she was regarded as a local hero who had defied expectations and served with distinction. The same society that had once found her choices shocking now claimed her as a pioneering daughter. It was both gratifying and ironic. She was finally acceptable to Nashville society precisely because she had rejected everything it represented. The pilot who caused her death lived with that knowledge for the rest of his life. He finished the war, returned to civilian life, and by all accounts was haunted by what had happened. Several people who knew him reported that he never fully recovered from the guilt, that Cornelia's death remained a defining trauma. He had made a thoughtless decision, showing off, not thinking about consequences, and someone remarkable had died because of it. That kind of burden doesn't lift. As decades passed, Cornelia Fort's name appeared increasingly in historical accounts of women's aviation and World War II homefront contributions. Historians researching the WASP program invariably encountered her story. The flight instructor who witnessed Pearl Harbor, who became one of the first WAFs, who died in service at 24. Her letters and journals, donated to archives by her family, provided rich source material for understanding what motivated women pilots and how they navigated institutional resistance. In 2002, President George W. Bush signed legislation granting military status to the WASPs, though most of the women were by then in their 80s or had already died. In 2009, President Barack Obama signed a legislation awarding the WASPs the Congressional Gold Medal, America's highest civilian honour. At the ceremony, several recipients spoke about Cornelia Fort specifically, ensuring that newer generations would hear her name. But perhaps the most meaningful memorial was the simplest: women flying. Every woman who became a commercial pilot, every woman who earned wings in the military, every girl who looked at an airplane and thought, "I could do that," all of them were living monuments to Cornelia Fort's courage and sacrifice. She had helped prove it was possible. She had paid the price of pioneering, and she had done so with grace, skill, and absolute commitment. The ripples of her life continued spreading outward, touching people and places she never knew, influencing aviation culture in ways both visible and invisible. She had wanted her work to matter, to contribute to something larger than herself. In that, she succeeded beyond any measure she could have imagined. Her life was short but extraordinarily consequential, and that, not the length but the impact, was ultimately what mattered most. To measure Cornelia Fort's true legacy, we must look beyond her individual accomplishments to the transformations she helped catalyse. She was one pioneer among many, but her unique combination of timing, skill and visibility made her particularly influential in opening aviation to women. The sky she loved, the sky that ultimately claimed her life, became through her efforts more accessible to others who shared her passion. When Cornelia learned to fly in 1940, women pilots were rare but not unprecedented. Amelia Earhart had captured public imagination in the 1930s before her tragic disappearance in 1937. Other women had set records, barnstormed, taught flying, and proven their capabilities. But aviation remained overwhelmingly male-dominated, with institutional barriers and cultural assumptions making it extraordinarily difficult for women to build flying careers. The military was even more closed. Women couldn't serve in combat roles, couldn't become military pilots, couldn't access the training and opportunities available to men. This wasn't just tradition, but policy, backed by arguments about physical limitations, emotional unsuitability, and the military's role as a masculine institution. Breaking these barriers required not just individual courage, but systematic advocacy, political pressure, and undeniable demonstration of capability. Cornelia's Pearl Harbor experience gave us something invaluable: visibility. Newspapers nationwide reported that a woman flight instructor had been in the air during the attack's opening moments, had narrowly escaped collision with Japanese aircraft, had safely landed while explosions rocked the island. Suddenly, a female pilot wasn't an abstract concept, but a real person who had witnessed history's pivot point. That visibility translated into credibility when she sought opportunities to serve. But visibility alone wasn't enough. What mattered was what she did with the opportunity. From her first ferry flight in November 1942 until her death in March 1943, Cornelia demonstrated consistent excellence. Every aircraft she delivered proved that women could handle military aircraft. Every safe flight countered arguments about female pilots being too emotional or insufficiently skilled. Every professional interaction showed that women belonged in military aviation. She also understood her role as representative. In letters and journal entries, she reflected on the burden of having every action judged as evidence about all women pilots. "I cannot have a bad day," she wrote. "I cannot make careless mistakes. I cannot show frustration or uncertainty. Not because I'm naturally perfect, but because every error I make will be used to argue that women shouldn't be flying. It's exhausting to be constantly evaluated, not just as an individual, but as a symbol." This burden, the exhaustion of representing an entire category of people rather than being judged as an individual, was something male pilots never faced. A man could have a bad flight without anyone concluding that all men were unsuited for aviation. But when women pilots made mistakes, critics used them as evidence of fundamental unsuitability. The double standard was obvious and unfair, but Cornelia accepted it as the price of pioneering. Other WASP members shared this burden and navigated it with similar professionalism. Together, they created a record of accomplishment that became impossible to dismiss. By the time the programme merged into the larger WASP organisation in 1943, women pilots had delivered thousands of aircraft safely. Their accident rate was lower than male ferry pilots. They had handled every aircraft type from primary trainers to B-17 bombers. The data overwhelmed the arguments. But data alone doesn't change cultures. What also mattered were the personal transformations among people who worked with women pilots. Male military personnel who initially resented or doubted the DUAFs found themselves working alongside skilled professionals who earned respect through performance. Base commanders who initially didn't want women pilots on their installations discovered they were reliable and competent. Mechanics, operations officers, and other personnel who interacted regularly with women pilots had their assumptions challenged by direct experience. These individual transformations, multiplied across hundreds of military bases and thousands of interactions, gradually shifted aviation culture. By war's end, the idea of women flying military aircraft seemed less radical, less shocking, more normal. The change wasn't complete. It would be decades before women gained access to full military aviation careers, but the foundation had been laid. Cornelia's death paradoxically amplified her influence. Her sacrifice made her story more compelling, more memorable. The flight instructor who survived Pearl Harbor, only to die in service, became a powerful narrative that captured imaginations. Articles about her appeared in national magazines. Her story was included in books about women's wartime contributions. She became shorthand for women's aviation pioneering, a symbol, though she would have disliked that reduction. The WASP program ultimately trained 1,102 women pilots between 1942 and 1944. They flew over 60 million miles, delivered more than 12,000 aircraft, and performed vital service freeing male pilots for combat duty. 38 died in service. When the program was disbanded in December 1944, no longer necessary as male pilots returned from combat and military needs contracted, the women went home without veterans' benefits, without recognition of military service, without acknowledgement that they had contributed meaningfully to victory. This denial of recognition seemed like the final insult. The women had served with distinction, accepted mortal risks, and contributed significantly to the war effort. But because they had never been granted full military status, remaining technically civilian employees, they were ineligible for benefits and honours that male pilots received automatically. The injustice rankled, particularly as years passed and the WASP's contributions faded from public memory. But the women themselves never forgot. WASP reunions continued for decades, preserving bonds formed during wartime service. They collected documents, preserved photographs, recorded oral histories. They insisted that their story be told, that their service be acknowledged, that younger generations understand what they had accomplished. This grassroots historical preservation meant that when researchers and historians finally turned attention to women's wartime roles, rich source material existed. Cornelia's story featured prominently in this recovered history. Her letters and journals, preserved by her family and later donated to archives, provided unusually detailed insight into a WASP's experiences and motivations. Historians found her writing eloquent and insightful, offering perspectives on gender, service and sacrifice that enrich broader narratives about World War II's home front. Academic interest in the WASPs grew from the 1970s onward, coinciding with second-wave feminism's attention to women's historical contributions. Dissertations, books and articles examined the programme from multiple angles: military necessity, gender politics, aviation culture, women's labour history. Cornelia appeared repeatedly in this scholarship, her visibility at Pearl Harbor making her story particularly compelling. Popular culture also embraced WASP history. Documentaries featured interviews with surviving members. Historical fiction explored their experiences. Museums created exhibits showcasing their contributions. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans developed permanent displays about women's service, including substantial coverage of the WASPs. Cornelia's Pearl Harbor experience made her a central figure in these presentations. Young women learning about the WASPs often found themselves particularly drawn to Cornelia's story. The combination of her Pearl Harbor survival and subsequent death created a powerful narrative arc. Someone who witnessed war's beginning, responded with service, and paid the ultimate price. Her youth made her relatable. Her determination made her inspiring. Her sacrifice made her meaningful. But beyond inspiring individuals, Cornelia's legacy manifested in institutional changes. When the US military finally opened flight training to women in the 1970s, Advocates reference WASP service as historical precedent. When women fighter pilots sought combat assignments in the 1990s, they invoked the WASP's record of flying every aircraft type. When women astronauts joined space programs, they acknowledged debt to aviation pioneers like Cornelia Fort. Each of these advances built on foundations the WASPs had laid. They had proven women could fly military aircraft safely and effectively. They had demonstrated that gender was irrelevant to aviation skill. They had challenged assumptions and changed minds through sustained excellence. Cornelia's individual contribution to this collective achievement was significant, not because she was uniquely talented, but because she seized her moment and maximised her impact. What would Cornelia think of her legacy? Based on her letters and journals, she would likely be simultaneously pleased and uncomfortable. Pleased that opportunities for women pilots had expanded so dramatically. Pleased that the WASPs finally received recognition they deserved. Pleased that her service had contributed to something larger than herself. But uncomfortable with being elevated as an individual hero when she saw herself as part of a collective effort. Uncomfortable with how history simplified complex motivations into neat narratives. Uncomfortable with being remembered more for dying than for living, for her Pearl Harbor survival than her ferry service, for her symbolic value than her actual contributions. She had wanted to be a pilot, not a symbol. She had wanted to serve competently, not be heroised. She had wanted opportunities for all women pilots, not individual recognition. The gap between what she sought and how she's remembered reflects how history often transforms pioneers into something their actual lives contradicted. Yet perhaps there's wisdom in remembering her precisely because of that gap. Cornelia Fort was extraordinarily ordinary, talented but not superhuman, determined but not fearless, committed but also uncertain, strong but also vulnerable. Her ordinariness made her remarkable. She proved that you didn't need to be extraordinary to break barriers, to serve courageously, to matter profoundly. You simply needed to care enough to try. That may be her most important legacy, demonstrating that pioneering is possible for anyone willing to accept its costs. You don't need special advantages or unique gifts. You need passion, commitment, willingness to work hard, and courage to persist despite obstacles. Cornelia had all these qualities, but none beyond the reach of others who share her determination. The sky she opened for others remains open. Women fly commercial jets, military fighters, spacecraft. They've broken every barrier Cornelia faced, and more besides. They've achieved things she couldn't have imagined, commanding combat missions, leading military aviation units, piloting Mars rovers from ground control. The progression from Cornelia's 1940 flight lessons to contemporary women's aerospace achievements illustrates how profoundly aviation culture transformed. But that transformation required pioneers willing to pay costs that beneficiaries would never face, required someone to be first, to break barriers, to prove possibilities. Required Cornelia Fort and women like her, willing to defy expectations, to serve despite resistance, to fly knowing that every flight carried weight beyond transportation. She lived 24 years. She flew approximately 1,100 hours. She delivered dozens of military aircraft. She witnessed Pearl Harbor. She died in service. These facts summarise her life, but cannot capture its meaning. That meaning exists in every woman who flies, every barrier that falls, every young girl who looks at the sky and sees possibility rather than prohibition. Cornelia Fort opened a door she didn't live to walk fully through herself. But countless others have passed through it, and countless more will follow. That, not her death, but the life she lived and the door she opened, constitutes her true memorial. The sky remembers those who loved it enough to risk everything for it, and the sky remains open, welcoming all who dare to fly. Every pioneer's life offers lessons, but Cornelia Fort's story speaks with particular urgency to contemporary struggles over equality, opportunity, and the costs of breaking barriers. Her experiences, from Nashville debutante to Pearl Harbor survivor to military aviation pioneer to tragedy at 24, illuminate truths about progress that remain relevant 8 decades after her death. The first lesson is about the price of pioneering. Cornelia paid with her life, but that wasn't the only cost she bore. She paid with family relationships, strained by choices they couldn't understand. She paid with social isolation, being too unconventional for Nashville society, but not fully belonging anywhere else. She paid with constant pressure to perform flawlessly, because every mistake would reflect on all women pilots. She paid with vigilance, knowing that acceptance was provisional and could be revoked if she failed. These costs extended beyond her personally to affect everyone close to her. Her family worried constantly, never fully at peace with her choices. Her fellow WAFS members bore the burden of her death, knowing it could have been any of them. The friends she left behind in Nashville lost someone they loved, but had never fully understood. Pioneering creates ripples of cost that extend far beyond the individual pioneer. Yet understanding these costs doesn't mean condemning the choice to pioneer. Cornelia made her decisions with open eyes. She understood the risks and accepted them. She calculated what she stood to gain, purpose, meaning, contribution, against what she stood to lose. She decided the exchange was worth it. That calculation deserves respect, even when we might personally choose differently. The second lesson concerns institutional resistance to change. The military establishment that eventually employed women ferry pilots initially resisted the idea strenuously. The resistance wasn't purely logical. Data showed women could fly safely, that pilot shortages required utilising all available talent. But institutions don't change based on data alone. They change when pressure becomes overwhelming, when alternatives become untenable, when pioneers force them to confront their assumptions. Cornelia and her fellow WASPs didn't convince skeptics through argument. They convinced through performance. Every safe flight, every aircraft delivered, every professional interaction accumulated into an overwhelming record that made opposition increasingly untenable. They won by showing rather than telling, by demonstrating rather than debating. This strategy, letting results speak louder than rhetoric, remains relevant for anyone challenging institutional barriers. But we should also note what they couldn't achieve through performance alone. Despite exemplary service, the WASPs were disbanded without military recognition. Despite lower accident rates than male pilots, women were excluded from military aviation for 3 decades after World War II. Despite proving their capabilities beyond any reasonable doubt, institutional resistance persisted. This reveals an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes excellence isn't enough. Sometimes barriers remain, not because pioneers haven't proven themselves, but because institutions and cultures resist change, even when evidence overwhelmingly supports it. Recognizing this doesn't mean abandoning effort, but it does mean understanding that progress often requires both demonstration of capability and sustained political pressure, both individual excellence and collective advocacy. The third lesson concerns the burden of representation. Cornelia wrote eloquently about the exhaustion of being judged not as an individual, but as evidence about all women. Every flight, every interaction, every decision carried weight beyond its immediate context. This burden, being made to represent an entire category of people, is familiar to anyone from an underrepresented group in any field. The burden is both unfair and unavoidable. It's unfair because individuals shouldn't have to represent entire demographics. A white male pilot having a bad day doesn't call into question all white male pilots, but a woman pilot's mistake becomes evidence about women's unsuitability. This double standard is obvious and unjust, yet it's also unavoidable because that's how human cognition works when encountering unfamiliar categories. When people have limited exposure to women pilots, they generalise from individual examples. The first woman pilot they encounter shapes their expectations about all women pilots. Pioneers become representatives whether they want that role or not. Understanding this dynamic doesn't excuse it, but it does help pioneers navigate it strategically. Cornelia accepted the burden while advocating for change that would eventually render it unnecessary. She performed flawlessly while working toward a future where women pilots would be judged individually. She carried the weight while building the infrastructure that would distribute it more fairly. The fourth lesson concerns moral clarity in complex situations. Cornelia's writings reveal someone who held strong convictions but avoided simplistic thinking. She believed passionately in America and was willing to die defending it, but she also criticized American racism and sexism. She loved military service but found military culture frustrating. She believed in the war's necessity but understood war's horror from witnessing Pearl Harbor. This capacity to hold multiple truths simultaneously, to recognize both righteousness and failure in the same cause, both necessity and tragedy in the same war, represents sophisticated moral reasoning. It's easier to embrace simple narratives: America good, enemies bad, war necessary, therefore uncomplicated, service meaningful, therefore beyond criticism. Cornelia refused these simplicities, insisting on seeing clearly even when clarity complicated her commitments. This moral complexity makes her more admirable, not less. Anyone can serve when the cause seems unambiguously righteous. It requires deeper courage to serve while maintaining clear sight about your cause's flaws and limitations. Cornelia demonstrated that courage, showing it's possible to be both committed and critical, both patriotic and honest about your country's failures. The fifth lesson concerns the relationship between individual action and systemic change. Cornelia was one person making individual choices. She couldn't single-handedly transform aviation culture or military policy. But her individual actions, combined with thousands of similar individual actions by other pioneers, accumulated into transformative change. This illustrates something crucial about how progress happens. It requires both systemic advocacy and individual demonstration. The WASPs needed Nancy Love and Jacqueline Cochran pushing for policy changes at high levels, but they also needed individual pilots like Cornelia, proving through daily performance that women belonged in cockpits. Neither approach alone would have sufficed. Progress required both. For contemporary struggles over equality and opportunity, this offers important guidance. Systemic advocacy matters. Lobbying, organising, demanding policy changes. But individual excellence also matters, proving capabilities, changing minds through direct experience, accumulating a record that makes opposition untenable. The most effective movements combine both approaches, neither dismissing political work as insufficient, nor expecting individual achievement alone to overcome structural barriers. The sixth lesson concerns sacrifice and its meaning. Cornelia died in an accident that was completely preventable. If the male pilot who caused the collision had exercised better judgment, she would have lived. Her death served no strategic purpose, advanced no cause, achieved no objective. It was simply tragic, a waste of talent and potential caused by someone else's recklessness. Yet, her service before death wasn't meaningless, because death came senselessly. The aircraft she delivered still supported the war effort. The barriers she helped break still opened opportunities for others. The example she set still inspired women who came after. Senseless death doesn't retroactively render meaningful life meaningless. This distinction matters for how we understand sacrifice. We often want sacrifices to be noble, soldiers dying in crucial battles, pioneers giving their lives to advance their causes. But much sacrifice in war and pioneering is senseless, preventable, tragically unnecessary. Acknowledging this doesn't dishonour those who died. Rather, it honours them by refusing to romanticise or sanitise the reality of what they experienced and lost. Cornelia Fort didn't die nobly in combat or while advancing her cause. She died in a stupid, preventable accident caused by someone else's thoughtless action. That makes her death more tragic, not less. and it makes our obligation to remember and learn from her life more important, not less, because we can't comfort ourselves that her death at least served some grand purpose. Her death served nothing, but her life served greatly. The seventh lesson concerns the long arc of recognition and justice. The WASPs were disbanded in 1944 without military status or benefits. For 30 years they were largely forgotten, their contributions unrecognised beyond their own community. Then, gradually, historians rediscovered their story. Advocacy groups pushed for recognition. Congress eventually granted military status in 2002 and the Congressional Gold Medal in 2009. This delayed recognition illustrates both the injustice of how pioneers are treated and the possibility that justice, however delayed, may eventually arrive. The women who served as WASPs deserved immediate recognition. They deserved veterans' benefits when demobilised. They deserved to be honoured while they were young, not decades later when most were elderly or deceased. The delay was profoundly unjust, yet eventual recognition mattered, even coming late. It meant their service entered official historical record. It meant younger generations could learn their stories. It meant the injustice of their treatment was acknowledged, if not fully remedied. Delayed justice doesn't erase the delay's harm, but it's still preferable to permanent erasure. For contemporary pioneers facing resistance or lack of recognition, this offers both warning and hope. Warning that recognition and justice may be delayed beyond any reasonable timeline, that pioneers often don't live to see the world they're creating, but hope that truth has persistence, that excellence eventually becomes undeniable, that justice delayed may still arrive. The eighth and final lesson is the simplest, but perhaps most important. Courage isn't the absence of fear, but action despite it. Cornelia Fort was afraid at Pearl Harbor, terrified by explosions, by death all around her, by the sudden transformation of peace into war. She had nightmares afterward, struggled with trauma, carried psychological scars. She knew ferry duty was dangerous, that pilots died regularly, that every flight carried mortal risk. She flew anyway, not because fear had vanished, but because commitment outweighed fear. Not because risk had disappeared, but because purpose justified risk. Not because death couldn't touch her, but because the alternative, being grounded by fear, letting terror prevent service, was worse than death itself. This definition of courage, as action despite fear rather than absence of fear, makes courage accessible. You don't need to be naturally brave or innately fearless. You simply need to care enough about something to act despite being afraid. Cornelia cared about flying, about service, about contributing to the war effort. She cared enough to accept fear as the price of meaningful action. Her example speaks across decades to anyone facing fears that threaten to prevent action. You don't need to overcome fear completely. You don't need to become someone different. You simply need to decide that what you're moving toward matters more than what you're afraid of. You need to act despite fear, choosing purpose over safety, meaning over comfort. These lessons from Cornelia Fort's life and death aren't comfortable. They acknowledge the real costs of pioneering, the unfairness of burdens imposed on those who challenge barriers, the persistence of resistance even when evidence overwhelmingly supports change. They reject romantic narratives about noble sacrifice, acknowledging that much sacrifice is senseless, even when the causes served are meaningful. But these lessons also offer hope, that individual actions accumulate into systemic change, that excellence eventually becomes undeniable, that delayed justice may still arrive, that courage is accessible to anyone who cares deeply enough. Cornelia Fort lived these truths. She pioneered knowing the costs. She served despite fears. She contributed meaningfully despite dying senselessly. And her example endures, speaking across decades to anyone facing barriers, anyone choosing courage over comfort, anyone daring to fly. As we approach the end of Cornelia Fort's story, we must confront a fundamental tension. How do we appropriately remember someone who would have resisted being remembered as a hero? Cornelia saw herself as simply a skilled pilot doing meaningful work. She explicitly rejected the language of heroism and sacrifice. Yet history insists on claiming her as a pioneer whose courage and sacrifice opened doors for others. Both perspectives contain truth, and the tension between them reveals something important about how we construct historical narratives. The historian's Cornelia Fort is a clear figure, one of America's first female military pilots, Pearl Harbor survivor, WASP pioneer, killed in service at 24. She fits neatly into broader narratives about women's World War II contributions, about aviation history, about the slow expansion of opportunities for women in traditionally male fields. Her story has a compelling arc, humble beginnings, dramatic transformation, meaningful service, tragic death. It's the kind of story history loves. But the actual Cornelia Fort was messier than this neat narrative suggests. She was contradictory, uncertain, sometimes frustrated and disappointed. She loved flying but found military bureaucracy maddening. She was committed to service but missed conventional life sometimes. She wanted to contribute but resented being constantly evaluated as a symbol rather than an individual. She was brave but terrified, determined but doubtful, strong but vulnerable. Which Cornelia Fort should we remember? The answer, unsatisfyingly, is both. We need the historical figure who represents larger truths about pioneering and sacrifice, but we also need the complex human being whose contradictions and uncertainties make her relatable and real. Holding both simultaneously, the symbol and the person, does justice to both history's needs and Cornelia's humanity. Her place in aviation history is secure but complicated. She was neither the first woman pilot nor the most accomplished. Amelia Earhart had greater fame. Jacqueline Cochran set more records. Nancy Love had more political influence. Many WASPs logged more hours and flew more aircraft types. But Cornelia's unique combination, Pearl Harbor survival, early WASP service, articulate writing and tragic death, gave her visibility that others lacked. This visibility has both benefits and costs. It ensures her story reaches wider audiences, inspiring people who might never hear about other WASPs, but it also distorts, making her seem more central than she actually was, elevating individual achievement over collective effort. The other 27 original WASP members, the thousands of women who earned pilot licenses in the 1930s and 1940s, the female pilots who came before and after, all contributed to transforming aviation culture. Cornelia was one thread in a much larger tapestry. Understanding this doesn't diminish her importance. Rather, it places her properly as an important contributor to collective change rather than a singular hero single-handedly transforming aviation. This is actually more meaningful. Singular heroes are exceptional, beyond emulation. But contributors to collective movements demonstrate that ordinary people, talented but not superhuman, determined but not fearless, can participate in transformative change. Cornelia's ordinariness makes her example more powerful, not less. Her Pearl Harbor experience deserves particular attention because it's simultaneously her most famous and most misunderstood aspect. The fact that she was in the air during the attack's opening moments is dramatic and historically significant. She was literally present at one of the 20th century's pivot points, witnessing the moment America entered its greatest war. But the experience wasn't noble or glamorous. It was terrifying. She narrowly escaped death through luck rather than skill. She spent the rest of the day watching people die while feeling helpless to intervene. The trauma stayed with her until her own death, 16 months later. She had nightmares, anxiety, survivor's guilt. Pearl Harbor wasn't an adventure, but a horror that marked her permanently. Yet she transformed that trauma into purpose. She could have fled, returned to Nashville, stopped flying, sought safety, and tried to forget. Instead, she used the experience as motivation to serve, to contribute, to ensure that the deaths she witnessed weren't meaningless. This transformation of trauma into purpose represents a particular kind of courage that deserves recognition while respecting the reality of what she experienced. The manner of her death also requires careful consideration. There's a temptation to find meaning in it, to suggest she died as she lived, in the sky doing what she loved. But this romanticizes what was actually a senseless, preventable accident. She didn't die pursuing some noble goal or accepting necessary risk. She died because another pilot made a reckless decision. There's no poetry in that, no meaning to extract beyond the arbitrary cruelty of preventable tragedy. Refusing to romanticize her death doesn't diminish her service. Her meaningful contribution was her life, the aircraft she delivered, the barriers she helped break, the example she set. Death didn't validate or complete that contribution. It simply ended it too soon. Acknowledging this, honestly, respects Cornelia more than false nobility would. She deserves to be remembered for how she lived, not for how she died. Her legacy extends far beyond aviation into broader questions about gender, opportunity, and institutional change. The resistance she faced, from her family, from Nashville society, from military culture, wasn't unique to aviation, but reflected widespread assumptions about women's proper roles. By challenging these assumptions through performance rather than rhetoric, she and her fellow WASPs helped shift cultural attitudes that extended well beyond flying. This broader impact is difficult to measure but nonetheless real. Every time someone's assumptions about women's capabilities were challenged by direct experience with women pilots, potential for cultural change was created. Multiply this across thousands of interactions at hundreds of military bases, and you begin to see how individual pioneers' actions accumulated into systemic transformation. Cornelia's contribution to this process was meaningful, even though she couldn't see its full fruition. Contemporary women pilots acknowledge this debt, even when unfamiliar with specific names. They understand they fly in skies opened by pioneers who face resistance they'll never encounter. The barriers Cornelia confronted, exclusion from military aviation, assumptions about women's unsuitability for high-performance aircraft, lack of facilities and recognition, have largely fallen. New barriers exist, but progress from Cornelia's era to now is undeniable. Yet we should resist triumphalist narratives that suggest all battles have been won. Women remain underrepresented in aviation, particularly in commercial and military flying. Cultural assumptions about who belongs in cockpits persist, though more subtly. Young women interested in flying still face discouragement and skepticism, though less overtly than Cornelia did. Progress is real, but incomplete. Remembering Cornelia Fort properly means understanding both how far we've come and how far remains. It means honouring her contribution without pretending the work she began is finished. It means using her example to inspire continued progress, rather than to congratulate ourselves on past achievements. She would have wanted her sacrifice to motivate action, not justify complacency. Her story also speaks to broader American narratives about World War II and the home front. Popular memory often focuses on military combat, while neglecting essential contributions from civilian workers, women, and minorities. The war couldn't have been won without massive industrial mobilisation, agricultural production, voluntary service, all primarily provided by people who never fired a shot in combat. Cornelia's service exemplifies these overlooked contributions. Recognising this expands our understanding of what war requires and who contributes to victory. It challenges narrow definitions of service that privilege combat over other essential roles. It acknowledges that war is won not just by soldiers, but by entire societies mobilising their full capabilities. Cornelia's story helps tell this more complete history, ensuring that women's contributions receive appropriate recognition. As time passes and direct memory fades, all WASPs have now died, as have most World War II veterans. maintaining accurate historical understanding becomes simultaneously more important and more challenging. Without living witnesses, we rely on documents, photographs, recordings, and historical analysis. These sources preserve facts but can't fully capture lived experience, the felt reality of being Cornelia Fort in December 1941 or March 1943. This is where imagination becomes necessary. Disciplined historical imagination that uses available evidence to reconstruct past experiences as faithfully as possible. What did it feel like to be a 24-year-old woman pilot in 1943, constantly proving yourself, bearing the burden of representation, knowing your service might not be recognised? We can't know completely, but we can try to understand, using empathy and historical evidence to bridge the gap between then and now. This empathetic historical imagination serves an important function. It keeps the past human, prevents it from becoming merely abstract data. Cornelia Fort wasn't just a name and dates and accomplishments. She was a feeling, thinking human being who experienced joy and fear, confidence and doubt, purpose and uncertainty. Remembering her humanity matters as much as recording her achievements. What would Cornelia make of how she's remembered? Based on her writings, she would likely feel conflicted, pleased that women's aviation contributions receive recognition, pleased that the WASPs finally received acknowledgement they deserved, but uncomfortable being elevated as an individual hero when she saw herself as part of a collective effort, uncomfortable with simplified narratives that smooth over the complex, contradictory reality of her experiences and motivations. She would probably want us to remember her as a skilled pilot who seized opportunities to serve meaningfully. She would want recognition for all WASPs, not just those whose stories happen to be most dramatic. She would want her example to inspire others to serve according to their abilities, whatever those might be. And she would want us to continue fighting for equality and opportunity, understanding that the work she began remains unfinished. In the 8 decades since her death, the world has transformed in ways she couldn't have imagined. Women have become astronauts, test pilots, combat pilots, airline captains. They've commanded space missions, led aviation units, broken sound barriers and altitude records. They've done everything Cornelia dreamed of and far more. Every one of these achievements builds on foundations that she and her fellow WASPs helped establish. But perhaps more importantly, thousands of women have become pilots without making headlines or breaking barriers. They've simply entered a profession now open to them, flying because they love it just as Cornelia did. This normalisation of women in aviation, the ability to fly without it being remarkable, represents the ultimate vindication of what the WASPs fought for. They didn't pioneer so that women pilots would always be unusual. They pioneered so that women pilots would eventually be unremarkable, accepted as naturally as male pilots. Cornelia Fort's place in history's sky is thus both prominent and humble. Prominent because her unique story, Pearl Harbor, WASP service, early death, gives her visibility and makes her memorable. Humble because she was one among many, contributing to collective change rather than achieving singular transformation. Both aspects matter. History needs memorable individuals to make abstract change concrete and human. But it also needs to remember that individuals succeed through collective effort, that no pioneer flies alone. The sky she opened remains open, welcoming all who share her passion. Commercial jets carrying hundreds of passengers fly with women at the controls. Military fighters defend American interests with women in the cockpits. Spacecraft venture beyond Earth with women among the crews. Young girls look up at contrails crossing blue sky and see possibility, not prohibition. All of this traces back, in part, to Cornelia Fort and women like her who refused to accept that the sky had a gender. Yet we must resist the temptation to view her story purely through the lens of progress achieved. If we remember her only as a stepping stone to contemporary achievements, we diminish her humanity and her actual experiences. She didn't live and die to serve our contemporary narratives about progress. She lived because she loved flying and believed in service. She died in a stupid accident. The meaning we extract from her life comes from us, not from some predetermined historical trajectory. This distinction matters philosophically and morally. Cornelia Fort had inherent worth as a human being, independent of her historical significance. She deserved to live, not because her death would inspire others, but simply because she was alive. The tragedy of her early death isn't primarily that it deprived aviation of her continued contributions, though it did, but that it deprived her of the life she should have lived. 80 more years of flying, of relationships, of experiences, of joy. That loss is fundamentally personal before it becomes historical. Keeping this perspective prevents us from treating historical figures as mere instruments of progress, existing only to advance narratives we construct in retrospect. Cornelia Fort existed for herself, pursued her own goals, lived according to her own values. That we can learn from her example is fortunate but secondary. Her primary obligation was to herself and those she loved, not to history or to us. Understanding this makes her choices more remarkable, not less. She didn't sacrifice herself for our benefit. We weren't even born yet. She made decisions based on her own values, commitments, and circumstances. That those decisions happened to advance broader social change was partially intentional. She knew she was pioneering, but also partially accidental. She couldn't have predicted exactly how aviation would evolve or what her specific contribution would mean decades later. This humility about historical causation is important. We can trace lines of influence from Cornelia Fort to contemporary women pilots, but those lines aren't straight or simple. Countless other factors contributed to aviation's transformation: technological changes, economic forces, political decisions, cultural shifts, other pioneers' efforts. Cornelia was one tributary feeding a much larger river. Recognizing this doesn't diminish her importance, it properly contextualizes it. Her story also illuminates something crucial about how societies change. Progress doesn't happen smoothly or inevitably. It requires constant effort from people willing to challenge unjust barriers. It requires accumulation of evidence that makes resistance increasingly untenable. It requires both individual demonstration and collective advocacy. And it requires time, often frustrating amounts of time, for cultures to adapt to new realities. The WASPs proved women could fly military aircraft safely and effectively in 1942 to 1944, yet women weren't admitted to military flight training until 1976, 32 years later. This gap between demonstration and recognition illustrates how slowly institutions change, even when evidence overwhelmingly supports change. Understanding this timeline helps contemporary advocates for equality maintain realistic expectations while continuing to push for faster progress. What would Cornelia think about contemporary aviation? She would surely be amazed and delighted by the opportunities available to women pilots. She would appreciate that women can now pursue full military aviation careers, fly combat missions, command squadrons. She would celebrate women airline pilots, test pilots, astronauts. She would be proud that the doors she helped open have stayed open and expanded. But she would also notice work remaining. She would observe that women remain underrepresented in aviation, particularly in certain sectors. She would notice subtle biases and assumptions that persist despite formal equality. She would recognise that achieving legal equality doesn't automatically produce cultural transformation, and she would encourage continued effort, understanding from personal experience that progress requires sustained commitment. If she could speak to contemporary women pilots, what would she say? Probably something simple and direct, consistent with her character. Something like, fly well, maintain high standards, support each other, don't let anyone convince you that you don't belong. And remember that you're not just flying for yourself, you're building a foundation for those who come after. This message, emphasising both individual excellence and collective responsibility, captures what she embodied. She flew for herself, pursuing personal passion and purpose, but she also flew consciously aware that her performance would affect opportunities for other women. She balanced self-interest and social obligation, recognizing that pioneers inevitably carry burdens beyond their individual goals. Contemporary pilots face different challenges than Cornelia did, but the fundamental dynamic persists. Anyone from an underrepresented group in any field carries representative burden, whether they want it or not. Their successes and failures get generalized in ways that majority group members never experience. This unfairness persists even as formal barriers fall. Recognizing it helps people navigate it, even though recognizing it doesn't eliminate it. As we conclude this exploration of Cornelia Fort's life and legacy, certain themes emerge with clarity. She was an ordinary person who did extraordinary things, not because she possessed superhuman capabilities, but because she refused to accept limitations that others tried to impose. She was brave without being fearless, committed without being certain, strong without being invulnerable. She made her choices, aware of costs, and willing to pay them. Her death was tragic, precisely because it was meaningless, a preventable accident caused by someone else's recklessness. But her life was profoundly meaningful, filled with purpose, contribution, and determination to make possibilities real for herself and others. The tragedy of early death doesn't retroactively render meaningful life meaningless. If anything, it makes us more obligated to remember and honour what was lost. Cornelia Fort lived 24 years, 9 months, and 14 days. She logged approximately 1,900 flying hours. She witnessed the attack on Pearl Harbor. She became one of America's first female military pilots. She delivered dozens of aircraft in service to her country. She died doing work she believed in. These facts summarize a life but cannot capture its essence, the felt experience of being fully alive, pursuing passion, serving purpose, accepting mortality as the price of meaningful existence. The sky she loved claimed her life, but couldn't erase her contribution. Every contrail crossing blue sky, every woman at aircraft controls, every young person who looks up and sees possibility, all carry forward something she helped create. Not through dying, but through living. Not through sacrifice, but through service. Not through being extraordinary, but through refusing to accept ordinary limitations. Her place in history's sky is secure, not as the brightest star, but as one of many points of light that together illuminate the path forward. She would have been satisfied with that. She never sought individual glory, only opportunity to fly and serve. That she accomplished both, that her brief life had lasting impact, that she contributed to transformation larger than herself. These achievements would have been enough. And so, we remember Cornelia Clark Fort, daughter of Nashville, pilot, pioneer, witness to history, casualty of war, contributor to progress. She didn't live to see completed. We remember her not to elevate her beyond humanity, but to honour it. We remember her not because she was perfect, but because she was real, flawed, uncertain, brave, committed, fully human in all the contradictory glory that humanity encompasses. The sky remains open, welcoming all who dare to fly. That openness, purchased through courage, maintained through commitment, expanded through persistent effort, stands as the true memorial to Cornelia Fort and all who pioneered alongside her. Not monuments of stone or metal, but living legacy measured in opportunities seized, dreams pursued, barriers overcome. She was in the sky when the first Japanese planes arrived, witnessing war's beginning. She was in the sky throughout her brief service, contributing to America's response. And she remains in the sky still, not physically but symbolically, present in every woman who flies, every barrier that falls, every young person who looks upward and sees not prohibition, but possibility. That is Cornelia Fort's place in history's sky. Not a fixed point, but a continuing presence. Not an ending, but a beginning. Not a conclusion, but an invitation. the invitation she extended through her life and death, to fly despite fear, to serve despite obstacles, to refuse limitations imposed by others' expectations, remains open to all who hear it, and the sky awaits all who accept. December 7th, 2025 will mark 84 years since Cornelia Fort witnessed the attack on Pearl Harbor from her Piper Cub above Oahu. The few remaining survivors of that day are now over 100 years old, their memories precious and fading. Soon, all direct witnesses will be gone, and Pearl Harbor will transition fully from living memory to history. But Cornelia's story persists, told and retold, adapted to each generation's needs and understanding. Her letters and journals remain in archives, available to researchers and writers. Photographs capture her confident smile, her pilot's stance, her obvious love of flying. Documentary footage occasionally includes brief mentions of her role, and people keep discovering her story. Historians researching women's wartime roles, aviation enthusiasts exploring WASP history, young women looking for examples of pioneers who preceded them. What keeps her story alive isn't primarily institutional recognition, though museums and memorials help, but rather the continuing relevance of what she represents. As long as people face barriers based on identity rather than capability, as long as pioneers must prove possibilities that shouldn't need proving, as long as courage requires acting despite fear rather than feeling no fear, Cornelia Fort's example resonates. Her story reminds us that progress isn't inevitable or automatic. It requires people willing to challenge unjust barriers, to persist despite resistance, to demonstrate capabilities that others claim don't exist. It requires both individual courage and collective effort. It requires patience for change that often comes frustratingly slowly. And sometimes it requires sacrifice, both the daily sacrifices of living as a pioneer and occasionally the ultimate sacrifice that Cornelia paid. But her story also reminds us that ordinary people can contribute to extraordinary change. Cornelia Fort wasn't superhuman. She was talented but not uniquely gifted, determined but not fearless, committed but not without doubts. What made her remarkable was decision-making, choosing challenge over comfort, choosing service over safety, choosing to fly despite all the obstacles placed in her path. Those choices remain available to everyone facing barriers or pursuing purposes larger than themselves. You don't need Cornelia's specific talents or her particular circumstances. You need her spirit, the refusal to accept limitations imposed by others' expectations, the willingness to persist despite difficulty, the commitment to contribute meaningfully however you can. The sky she opened for others remains open. New challenges and barriers emerge, but the fundamental truth she demonstrated persists. Capability, not category, should determine opportunity. She proved it through performance. Others have expanded on that proof. But the work continues, requiring each generation to defend and extend the freedoms previous generations secured. As we conclude her story, we return to where we began, December 7th, 1941, 8:15 a.m. Cornelia Fort, in a Piper Cub above Pearl Harbor, 60 seconds before history changed forever. In that moment, she was simply a flight instructor doing her job, unaware of what was coming, focused on teaching her student proper landing technique. Then came the Japanese planes, the explosions, the desperate landing, the survival. Everything changed in that moment. For America, for the world, for Cornelia personally. And in the 16 months she had remaining, she transformed trauma into purpose, skill into service, personal passion into collective contribution. She flew well, she served honourably, she broke barriers, she inspired others, she died too young, and she left a legacy that endures 8 decades later, not primarily in monuments or official recognition, though those matter, but in the simple, powerful fact that the sky she loved remains open to all who share her passion. Cornelia Clark, Fort, February 5th, 1919, March 21st, 1943. Pilot, pioneer, witness to history, casualty of war, forever part of the sky she helped open for others.